I'm going to talk about the project Safeguarding Democratic Values in Digital Political Practices, as you said, led by Professor Nathalie Helberger, Claes de Vreese, and Beate Rüssler, and also working in the project are Amanda Rosian, me, Eva Groen, Tom Dobber, and Fabio Votta. And I focused in this presentation on sort of on the content of the project, actually. I think we started something like 1.5 years ago, although we have sort of an overlapping structure where some people actually started later. But sort of from the beginning, let's say, it's been roughly 1.5 years now. And we have also several papers in revise and resubmit stage. We've developed a tool at the very beginning, actually, of the project, which I'll tell you something about. But so I focused on a few of the substantive findings so far. But I wanted to begin with something that actually happened outside of our project, but that's very interesting for us at the moment. And that's the fact that there have been a proposal from the EU for a regulation of micro-targeting. And you can see that the recommendations or the ideas within that proposal actually map out quite nicely on the themes that we've been researching so far. So I thought it would be a nice start. And of course, it also shows sort of the urgency and the relevance of researching this topic at this moment. Now, in the explanation, let's say, of the regulation, there are a number of reasons mentioned for regulating micro-targeting, which I've mentioned here. So fairness, equal opportunities, transparency is a very important pillar, but also the right to be informed, the fundamental right even to be informed in an objective, transparent and pluralistic way. And so the formal aims of the regulation are first the harmonization of the internal market by setting sort of the same transparency standards for all providers, let's say, of political ads. But also protecting persons with regard to the use of their data, and not explicitly made explicitly as an aim of the regulation, but still the suggestion is in there, is that it's also to really minimize sort of negative effects on citizens' political rights. And these are really sort of the three themes along which we've conducted our research so far, and that's sort of our I think our findings map out on, because what the regulation proposes is first of all greater transparency. So and that's first of all towards individual citizens, so providing them with labels that make clear that it is actually a political ad and who sponsors it. But also collecting the more data about these ads and about targeting criteria into something like an ad archive or something public for people to look at and to find what kind of targeted ads have been distributed. So that's one important part of the proposal. But another one is also really prohibiting certain forms of targeting now. The use of this on the basis of certain types of data, sensitive data. Now, of course, that type of data was already sort of limited, or people couldn't use this type of data, but still it's mentioned explicitly in this proposal as well. And these lines return in our findings. So first, there's just what we've looked at is the prevalence of micro-targeting and its effects. So these reasons for concern, really. But also the value of transparency. So does it work? What does it have to offer? And the effects of political micro-targeting for citizen autonomy and particularly manipulation. And so I wanted to go through these three. That's sort of the structure. So first, we actually started with building a dashboard which made sort of explicit and public the information as far as possible about micro-targeting in the Netherlands. And this also gained a lot of media attention, and the data was also useful for other projects. And so it made targeting visibly in the Netherlands as far as possible, because it also learned us immediately some lessons about transparency and the need for transparency. But first, just a bit about targeting, because what we saw is that there are indeed some strong skews in ad delivery. Some parties reach many more men than women, for instance, some vice versa. On the other hand, spending was not that high, if you looked at Dutch parties at least, so that was interesting. But what we also found is that on the basis of the information available, it's actually very difficult to provide real transparency into the targeting aspect of it, because while there are things like an ad library, they do not actually provide a lot of data about the actual targeting. And so you have to make assumptions. And for instance, when you look at spending, there are actually large boundaries in sort of under and upper limits in spending. So it also taught us very much that sort of creating more transparency is important if we want to get good insight and a grip, let's say, as a society on this phenomenon. So this is not just sort of the qualms of being a researcher. Of course, it's of great public importance to create such transparency. Another aspect that we looked at when it comes to micro-targeting as such and its political effect is the relationship between micro-targeting and negative campaigning. And by negative campaigning, in this case, we really mean toxic campaigning. So using unfair insults, being uncivil. That study showed us that there is actually, we couldn't show a connection, let's say, let's put it that way. So from the data, we have to say that micro-targeted messages are not more toxic. On the other hand, again, we have to sort of note the limitations here of the data available. And that means that you have to use proxies, for instance, which, you know, of course, again, are important to look at further, let's say. Then we also had a look at the value of transparency. So, and particularly veracity labels for political ads. And as we see in the regulation, this is a solution that is often sort of proposed as a way of making political advertising, and particularly targeted political advertising, more fair. Because it gives citizens at least insight, of course, in who sends these ads, who pays for them, etc. But there are also a lot of questions about whether this actually works, so whether people actually see labeling at all, and whether this in any way affects their evaluation or their perception of the ad. And the study in our project does show indeed some of these problems. So it's indeed clear that not all of these veracity labels are actually noticed by everyone, and that it very much depends on the design, whether they're actually effective in affecting people's perception of the ad, and to what extent it is actually truthful. So we saw that labels sort of shown concurrent with the start of an ad did have some effect. But if it was shown before the start of the ad, it didn't. And those are, of course, quite sort of subtle differences that are very important if you want to make something like labeling and transparency in that sense a part of how you are going to regulate or deal with political micro-targeting. So that's another finding. And then finally, we also had a look at this relationship which the proposal for regulation also very clearly makes between, let's say, citizen autonomy, put quite broadly, and the persuasive effects and perhaps distortive persuasive effects of political micro-targeting. This is, of course, a concern that you often hear in relation to political micro-targeting. And we had a sort of a two-track approach to this topic. So on the one hand, we did a normative analysis, an ethical evaluation of manipulation as a democratic wrong, defining what it is, in fact, that makes that defines manipulation and thus makes it a democratic wrong. And so we argue that that manipulation is necessarily an intentional attempt to getting someone else to make a mistake in how they form their beliefs, emotions, behavior, choices, a whole range of things that are politically relevant. And so that techniques like deception, but also playing to cognitive weaknesses, for instance, or using emotional pressure, are forms of manipulation. And that means that some forms of micro-targeting are manipulative, but certainly not all. What we've also noted, and I think this is also an important contribution, is that manipulation is a problem at the individual level, so at the level of how individual citizens are persuaded, but also at the level of the collective. So it can lead to, let's say, peer-to-peer manipulation, even if those peers amongst themselves do not intend it to be this way. So if you send, if you forward an ad or a message to someone else through which you have been manipulated, then you may not have the intention to manipulate someone else, but it continues itself. It may also, in a manipulative way, affect the shaping of public opinion. So as a collective process, by suppressing certain views, for instance, and perhaps stronger highlighting others. And it also has an effect on the system as such. So there's a manipulative threat through gathering data and the possibility that it might be used, even if this doesn't happen very much. So also at the system level, there is a possible problem of manipulation with political micro-targeting. So this is the first sort of track that we followed there. But we also then look at how citizens actually evaluate political micro-targeting. And there we see something interesting, and that is that citizens, or something else that's interesting, of course. There we see that citizens actually evaluate all forms of political micro-targeting as manipulative. So whether that's the targeting happens on the basis of issues or of general characteristics, personality, or vulnerabilities, they consider all of these manipulative. And so in that sense, we would argue that there's actually an over-worry about manipulation in micro-targeting, but they do not consider most of these techniques actually to be harming their autonomy, so their ability to make their own political choices. So we also see an under-worry, you can say, about how it actually affects people's autonomy. So all these findings so far, I think, will inform some way in which we will now try and respond to these proposals for regulation. I think we have quite something to say about that. And I think that's led me to the proposal for the theme, which is quite general, because I think for us too, we're very happy to talk about any of these findings and how they connect with yours and the kinds of issues that have come up. But I think this issue sort of comes up, I thought, in many of our projects, which is how to sort of make improvements in a non-ideal world. Certain approaches may perhaps not map perfectly onto sort of reaching an ideal, but still they may make some improvements. And so I think that would be perhaps interesting to see how other researchers deal with this problem. But again, I'm very happy to talk about any of these topics.